So while Evan is talking, we do ask that you keep your questions to the chat rather than unmuting yourself. He will be monitoring the chat while he is speaking, so your questions will be answered throughout the presentation. If you do want to share any questions or comments after the fact, you're welcome to unmute yourself once we're finished with the presentation. As we were just saying, this program is being recorded, so just be careful what you say because there is going to be a record of it. And then just while I have your attention, there are some programs coming up that you might be interested in. Next Monday, which is Pearl Harbor's anniversary, we have Paul Zigo, who is from the World War II, the Memorial Institute, World War II Memorial Institute is coming to do the Pearl Harbor A Day of Infamy talk. And then that same Wednesday, 1 week from today, we do have someone from the Laurel House coming to talk about identifying different indicators of domestic violence, both in victims and perpetrators. And then we also have the following week, Ryan Conroy coming back to talk about Royersford during World War I. So if you're interested in any of those programs, you can find those registration links on our website or on our Facebook page. So now I'm going to turn it over to Evan, who is a speaker and author with a radio and TV background, and his expertise lies in the business and politics of sports, which will serve us well tonight as he introduces us to the evolution of football in America. All right, Evan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you for inviting me to the Royersford Library. I am no stranger to the Philadelphia area. That's somebody I picked up at one of my talks at St. Joe's. That he's a big green thing, and he kind of strangles you when you talk. So he was at one of my talks at St. Joe's back in 2011. My name is Evan Weiner. I have been covering the politics of sports business for a long time, and back in 1982, I broke the fact that the National Football League Players Association, National Football League owners strike was over. And it's one of these typical stories that you get if you're a reporter. I went to the men's room at the Sheridan on 7th Avenue and 54th Street, Manhattan. And Gene Upshaw, who was the #2 guy at the NFLPA at the time, we both lined up next to one another, and then he kind of looks at me with a side eye, said, "It's over." And I said, "What's over?" "That's over." "Oh, could I tell it to the world?" He said, "Yeah, it's over." We washed our hands. I went out, grabbed the telephone, and I was doing a spot for Arnold Dean at WTIC Radio in Hartford. I said, "Arnold, it's over." He said, "What's over?" I said, "The strike is over." He said, "How'd you know?" I said, "I just went to the bathroom with Gene Upshaw, and he told me." And he said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I am sure." You don't mess around in the bathroom with something as serious as that. But that was one of my first scoops in my life. I had one in 1978 when John Lindsay announced that he was running for senator, state of New York, the former New York mayor. But that's old acquaintance of mine. That's my book. It's called American's Passion: How a Coal Miner's Game Became the NFL in the 20th Century. And if you are really looking at the NFL and you say, "Oh, it's a multi-billion-dollar business, they must have had all of these business plans, and they must have executed all of them," they didn't. It was a matter of luck that the NFL became the NFL it is today. Because even if you look into the 1950s, the National Football League, a team like the Philadelphia Eagles, that was a mom and pop store, basically. And if you look at the Eagles, they probably opened up in July, played 6 preseason games, and played 12 regular season games. And if they didn't get to the NFL championship, it was over, and they closed down for 6 months. In fact, somebody was telling me that years ago, when the Eagles were playing at Franklin Field, that you could actually get a discount on Eagles tickets if you were attending a UPenn game. It was a mom and pop operation. That's all it was. It was a coal miner's game, the mom and pop store to multi-billion-dollar business, and about 300 miles west of where you are today. The roots of the NFL were there in the coal mines in Western Pennsylvania. The first game was played not too far from you. It was played up in New Jersey. You get back on the turnpike, you go up the road, and you could find Princeton and Rutgers, and you could have done that. Well, there was no turnpike in 1896, but Princeton played Rutgers in a game that doesn't resemble anything that you might see on Sunday or Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday afternoon, because Baltimore played Pittsburgh this afternoon. The game was totally different. It was a form of rugby, and Rutgers beat Princeton by a score of 6-4 in New Brunswick, New Jersey, at the Rutgers facility. The game was played 2 teams of 25 men, rugby-like rules. And the teams would line up with 2 members of each team remaining more or less stationary near the opponent's goal in hopes of being able to slip over and score from an unguarded position. Now, football is the perfect TV game. All the players, when you start the line of scrimmage, you could virtually see every player on the field. But it would have been a little unwildly here back in 1896 if Runa Arlich was delivering a game on Monday Night Football with Howard Cosell. There were 23 players. There were the 2 players by the goal line, and there were 23 players in groups of 11 and 12. There were 11 fielders lined up in their own territory as defenders. There were 12 bulldogs that carried the battle. And the rules were, well, there really were no rules. The first rules for American football were written in 1876 by a guy by the name of Walter Camp, who was the coach at Yale. Every year, maybe not in 2021 because of COVID, but every year in New Haven, there's the Walter Camp Awards, which are given to outstanding college football players. It's the last awards dinner of the year. And Walter Camp was the guy who wrote the rules of American football, and that was in 1876. The first player who was known to be paid was a guy by the name of Pudge Heffenflinger, and he played in Pittsburgh. The Allegheny Athletic Association and the Pittsburgh Athletic Club were 2 of the first teams, and probably players got paid under the table, but we know that old Pudge was given $500 by the AAA to play in the first game against the Pack, and he was the first person to openly be paid to play football. He was a guard. You probably wouldn't have today a guard as your highest paid player. He had been an All-American at Yale University under Walter Camp. This is a 16-year-old player by the name of John Bralear, also out of the Pittsburgh area. 1895, 16 years old, he became the first football player to openly turn pro, to tell people, I'm a pro. He took $10 and took some expenses to play for Latrobe and the YMCA in Latrobe, and that game was played against the Jeannette Athletic Club. The Allegheny Athletic Association fielded a completely professional team in 1896. It was only 2 games. The guys got paid $5-10. That is the 1897 Latrobe football team, and I like the guy with the derby there. The guy with the beard and the derby and all of that stuff. That is the team picture of the Latrobe football team of 1897. Latrobe, of course, the hometown of Arnold Palmer. The Latrobe Athletic Association football team, they were the first to play a full season with just professionals in 1897. Now, Philadelphia got its first team in 1899. And this is kind of interesting because this team predates what happened with the Green Bay Packers about 21 years later. The Frankfurt Athletic Association was organized May 1899. Now, you could buy shares of the team. It was $10 and you get a share of the team. But there were also others who could throw in a couple bucks here and there and say, I'm a contributing member for $1 to $2.50, which was a lot of money in 1899. There was a charter written for this team which said that all profits shall be donated to a charity. All of the team's excess income was donated to local charities. The original Frankfurt Athletic Association team and Frankfurt is part of the Philadelphia metropolitan area, disbanded prior to the 1909 season. But it wouldn't be the last Frankfurt team. There would be another one about 15 years later. The NFL's oldest team comes from Chicago. It was known as the Morgan Athletic Club, and they're still playing today. They're known as the Arizona Cardinals, and they play in Glendale, Arizona. It was a neighborhood team. They took the name Morgan Athletic Club on the south side of Chicago. No word on whether bad Leroy Brown was part of that team. The team later became known as the Normals, then Racine Cardinals for a street in Chicago, and then the Chicago Cardinals. Why the Cardinals name? Because that was the color of their jersey. The team would relocate to St. Louis in 1960, and Bill Paley was the chairman of CBS, and he started his empire in Philadelphia with WCAU radio back in 1927, 1210 on your AM radio dial. The team would go to St. Louis, and Paley would pay some of the expenses moving the team from Chicago to St. Louis. In 1988, Bill Bidwell moved the team to Tempe, Arizona, renamed it the Phoenix Cardinals. In 1994, after a dismal failure in marketing the team, he decides, okay, let's call them the Arizona Cardinals and see if we could become a statewide team. The team remains the oldest continuing operation in pro football. 1902, there was a league, the Chicago League, and guess who was the champion? The Cardinals, champion of the Illinois or Chicago Football League. Now, the Philadelphia Athletics baseball team, Connie Mack, the Philadelphia Athletics baseball team, and the Philadelphia Phillies baseball team formed the professional football team or professional football teams in 1902, and they joined the Pittsburgh Stars. That league was called the National Football League in 1902, even though it only had Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. The Chicago Football League was formed of several local clubs, such as the Chicago Tigers, some outside Chicago, well, Hammond, Illinois, really, in Indiana, rather. Hammond, Indiana is just right over the border from Chicago. Rockford, Illinois, Decatur, Illinois, Racine, Illinois, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There was also a league in Ohio, and there was a league in New York State. By 1904, Ohio had 7 pro teams. Massillon won the professional title of the Ohio Independent Championship League. Massillon is still a big name in football, except now it's high school football in that area. Theodore Roosevelt. Now, normally you would not associate Theodore Roosevelt with college football. Oh yeah, he was an outdoorsman, and he believed in rugged individualism and being outdoors and in doing a lot of exercise. But he never played football. However, he's involved in football. Theodore Roosevelt threatened to ban football in America unless the rules were implemented to make the game safer, because 40 players, reported 40 players, there probably were more. Nobody went through the coal mines of Western Pennsylvania or Eastern Ohio to see if anybody died from football. But on the college level, 40 players died from injuries suffered on the field over a 2-year period, 1904 and 1905. Of course, no one could actually figure out how a president like Roosevelt could actually end the game. What's he going to do? Go to the Western Pennsylvania coal mines and tell those guys, no, you can't play? Well, maybe he could ban college football, maybe, and I doubt he could do that, bring it up before the Supreme Court. But he felt that the threat of a ban and using the bully pulpit would be enough to get changes in playing rules to make the game safer. And he did. The Roosevelt Initiative would eventually lead to the formation of the NCAA, but it wasn't an easy row to hoe. Theodore Roosevelt brought in the presidents of Harvard, Charles Eliot, who he absolutely hated. He hated Eliot. He brought in the president of Yale, along with Walter Camp, and the president of Princeton, the Ivy League schools. They were the ones mostly playing football. And this is in December of 1905, and he tells them, fix the game or else. Now, Roosevelt hated Charles Eliot. He absolutely despised Charles Eliot, and Charles Eliot wasn't too fond of Roosevelt. Now, the Harvard contingent wanted changes or just get rid of football, totally. Let's just get rid of football. Walter Camp, who wrote the rules back in 1876, said, no, let's keep it as is. And Princeton was there and they could have gone either way. But this was one of the problems that was facing Roosevelt and also the college football presidents and the people involved with football. This is not unusual to see a cartoon in a newspaper or a magazine back in 1904, 1905 with something like this. Here's a football player. He's about ready to snap the ball. Notice the ball looks like a watermelon because that's what it was. It was watermelon shaped, bigger than today's football. And there's the shroud wrapped around this guy, death. And people were talking because football, and you could see bodies laying on the field, because football was maiming players and killing players. Something had to be done. I demand that football changes its rules or be abolished. Change the game or forsake it, said Roosevelt. But Roosevelt didn't really want to get rid of the game. And there were a number of reasons he didn't want to get rid of the game. One was Charles Eliot, who did. So he wasn't going to give in to Eliot. Secondly, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. liked the game. Even though he suffered major injuries in high school and college, this is Roosevelt's son, and he's saying, hey, the game is fine. You know, let's keep it. And there's another thing. If you might remember the war of the Spanish-American War of 1898, Theodore Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he actually went out and fought on the battlefield. And it was the Rough Riders that accompanied him up San Juan Hill and in Cuba. And 10 of the Rough Riders, the soldiers who fought with him in Cuba, listed their occupations as football players when they enlisted in 1898. So Roosevelt has his son, he's got his Rough Riders, and he's got this hatred of Eliot. So he has a lot of ammunition to keep the game going. So he gets the guys in the office and says, let's do something. They bang their heads together. It's December of 1905, and the American Football Rules Committee is formed as a result of the pressure from the bully pulpit in the Oval Office. And in 1906, plays were designed to open up the game and allegedly make it less dangerous to play. I could tell you stories about guys who I know who suffered multiple concussions who literally can't function today. The committee passed legislation that led to the introduction of the forward pass, changing the distance gained for a first down from 5 yards to 10 yards, so you wouldn't pick up anybody and throw them anymore. And also, the football shape was changed a little bit. And more importantly, all the mass formations, gang tackling, throwing players are all bad. Supposedly, it made the game safer. The next White House summit on football would be in 2014, 109 years later, with Barack Obama. Jim Thorpe, All-American. Jim Thorpe, Olympic hero, 1912. He had his medals taken away because he was a professional. He's with the Canton Bulldogs. And Jim Thorpe, in 1915, signs a deal with the Canton Bulldogs. Jack Krusick ran the Bulldogs with Thorpe and his former Carlisle, Pennsylvania teammate. Carlisle Indians from central Pennsylvania, right? Pete Kallick, starring Canton, went 9-0-1. They won the Ohio League Championship and claimed the Pro Football Championship. A lot of people claim the Pro Football Championship. It wouldn't be until the Depression time before there was officially a championship game. Curly Lambeau, Green Bay Packers. Curly Lambeau was the guy who organized the Green Bay Packers in 1919, and he was way ahead of his time, except he probably didn't know it. Curly Lambeau and George Calhoun organized the Green Bay Packers, whose namesake was Lambeau's employee, the Indian Packing Company. Curly Lambeau probably didn't realize it, but he signed the first naming rights deal ever. You could put your name, well, they didn't put the Indian Packing Company's name on our team. They called themselves the Packers, make it a lot easier. He sold, basically, he took $500 because he needed to buy equipment, and also got a deal where they could use the Indian Packing Company's fields for practices. So in a sense, what you see today with naming rights and all this other stuff, whether it's any of the Philadelphia teams, they all have naming rights with everybody else. It was Curly Lambeau who started it, and probably quite by accident. The NFL is coming by 1920, but it wasn't called the NFL in 1920. The Akron Pros were in the NFL, or the NFL's predecessor. The owners, they really weren't owners. They were guys who invested in these teams, and these teams were fly-by-night outfits, here today, gone tomorrow. Another league, hey, this league, I'll go to this league. Oh, you don't want that, us in that league? Well, I'll go to this league. So there were a lot of leagues. It was causing problems because the owners were looking, saying, hey, these guys are jumping from team to team, and we got to pay more money for them. We got to put an end to that. We don't want dramatic rising salaries, which might be from $10 a game to $20 a game. Players jumped from one team to another, and there was the use of college players on the weekends who were enrolled in college. John Bankard, who was the curator of the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio, the late John Bankard. About 20 years ago, we were talking about some stuff, and he was talking about a guy by the name of George Tipton, and he said he was a center, and he was missing his index finger. He was telling a story about some guy who played against his team, Trafton. It was George Trafton, I'm sorry. Played against Trafton's team on Saturday in college, because the next day he said, hey, wait a minute, didn't I see you yesterday? He said, no, you didn't see me yesterday. Because the players used to wear masks, not necessarily to protect them from injury, but to protect their identity. So they still wanted to play college, and they were playing pros on Sunday. He said, it's funny thing, you know, there was a guy who looked just like you. I know you say no, but he was also missing an index finger. They had played each other on Saturday, and they played each other on Sunday. It was going on, and the league owners didn't really care. The college game didn't care. The APFC starts in 1920. The Akron Pros, the Canton Bulldogs, Cleveland Indians, the football team, and the Dayton Triangles meet in Canton, Ohio at a Humpmobile showroom, Humpmobile being a car in those days, and they form the American Professional Football Conference. There's a second meeting, and there are teams from Ohio, Indiana, New York, and Illinois in attendance, and that league becomes the American Professional Football Association. Notice no teams from Pennsylvania, not quite yet. The NFL, well, not quite yet, but there was a team called the Staleys, led by George Halas, who in 1919 was the New York Yankees right fielder, and he was replaced by a guy in 1920. You might have heard of the guy. I don't know if you have or haven't. George Herman Ruth, Babe Ruth. George Halas left the New York Yankees, and there's Trafton in that picture, and you can't see his finger. If you look to the left of the 1920, the guy in the front row at the end is George Trafton without his finger. The name change in George Halas. George Halas also cuts a deal like Curly Lambeau. Now, George Halas was not very sophisticated in sports marketing. He wasn't sophisticated at all, although he did own a sporting goods company in the Loop in Chicago. The Chicago Bears start in 1921. A.E. Staley turned the Decatur Staleys over to the player coach, George Halas, who moved the team to what was then known as Cubs Park, and you know it today as Wrigley Field. And that was not even built for the Cubs. It was built for the Chicago Whales of the Federal League. A little trivia there. It was just put on the National Historic Society rolls the other day, Wrigley Field. Staley gave Halas $5,000 to keep the name Staley's for one more year, and kept the team going. Halas made his halfback, Ed Dutch Sturleman, his partner. Fritz Pollard, there's a football society called the Fritz Pollard Society, and they monitor the NFL to make sure that African Americans are given an opportunity at head coaching jobs, coordinator jobs, or just coaching jobs in general. Fritz Pollard was one of the first African Americans to play in the National Football League. And he was also he was the first African American coach in the NFL. In fact, I'll tell you a story. The Los Angeles Raiders are playing the New York Jets. It's a Monday night football game up at Giants Stadium in East Rutherford. I'm allowed to say Giants, right? Around Philadelphia, you won't get too mad at me if I say Giants or Redskins or Cowboys, okay? We're friends, right? Anyway, because I know you hate those. You hate Dallas, you hate Washington, and you hate the Giants. So I know all that because I've spoken in Philadelphia before. Anyway, Art Shell was named coach of the Los Angeles Raiders. Los Angeles beats the Jets. Well, everybody beats the Jets. But anyway, and we're talking after the game, and they're saying, "Wow, you're the first African American coach," and all that. And I said to Art, I said, "The second, Fritz Pollard, the first." He said, "You're right about that." Fritz Pollard was the first head coach in NFL history. He was co-coach of the team in Akron. You know, people don't realize there was an NFL back in 1921. Pollard was from Brown University, and he said it was evident in my first year at Akron back in 1919 that they didn't want blacks in there getting that money. And here I was playing and coaching and pulling down the highest salary in pro football. Pollard, after the 1920s, never came back to the NFL. Talk about that in a couple minutes. And there is Curly Lambeau's Packers, still getting money from the Indian Packing Company. In 1922, Green Bay withdrew from the APFA after admitting the use of players who had college eligibility remaining during the 1921 season. They didn't cover up their players very well. So they're out. They're kicked out. But Lambeau said, "Hey, listen, you know what? We want back in the league." And he paid $50 to buy back his franchise. $50. Jeff Lurie, his Eagles probably are worth what, $2.4 billion? Even if you factor in 1922 dollars, that can't be more than $500. But he didn't have the money to run the team, so they borrowed something from the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets. Local merchants arranged a $2,500 loan for the club, and a public non-profit corporation was set up to operate the team. 98 years later, that public nonprofit corporation is still there. You could buy Green Bay Packers stock. It's worthless. I mean, to them, it's worth something. To you, it's just worth, basically this piece of paper. They are the only public nonprofit corporation team in North America, whether it's the NFL or Major League Baseball, National Hockey League, NBA, MLS rather. They're the only ones, and they've been grandfathered into the league. There are 31 owners today in the NFL, and the board of directors for the Green Bay Packers. Should the team fail, and should the team not be able to operate in Green Bay and move or sold, and they get back the $2 million, $3 million that somebody would buy for the team, the local VFW, or rather the local American Legion post, would get that money. They're not going anywhere. Green Bay is not going anywhere. They make money every year, and you can actually go look at their books every year because it is a public nonprofit corporation. Red Grange saved the National Football League as we know it. Red Grange was a great player at the University of Illinois. Red Grange was one of those guys who was bigger than life because of newspapers and because of radio in the 1920s. He was there with Jack Dempsey, and he was there with Babe Ruth, and he was there with Charlie Chaplin, and he was there with Al Jolson, and he was there with Rudolph Valentino. He was very well known, the Galloping Ghost. It's 1925, and the NFL is on the brink of falling apart. The New York Giants, Tim Mara buys that franchise in 1925 for $500. Now, the people who own franchises, the original people who owned franchises in the National Football League were people like Tim Mara, who was a numbers runner and a gambler. People like Big Bill Donovan, who bought the Dayton Triangles and moved them to Brooklyn, where they became the Brooklyn Dodgers. He was a bootlegger. There were guys who took chances like George Halas, like Curly Lambeau. And there was a guy like Art Rooney in the 1930s who has a big day at the racetrack in New York. He's got all this money. He goes back home to Pittsburgh. In 1934, he says, hey, I'm going to buy a franchise for Pittsburgh with the winnings from Aqueduct or Belmont Raceway, wherever he was. He was one of the two raceways. And he buys a franchise. These were the owners of the National Football League. They had no business savvy, and they just went from literally game to game. I used to speak, or I still speak of the place in Riverdale, New York, in the Bronx. And about 15, 20 years ago, this guy was telling me he played with the New York Giants in 1928. And even in his older age, he was a big, tall guy with muscular built, and he must have been in his 80s. And when he started talking about, and he was a wide receiver with the team, said, how much did you get per game? And he laughed. He said, we almost had to pay them. So we got about $5 or $10 a game. And that's what they got, $5 or $10 a game. But late in the 1925 season, George Halas, who ran the league, nothing happened without George Halas. He ran the league. He decides, you know what, even though we're not supposed to use college players, I'm going to sign Red Grange, who is the big star at the University of Illinois, about 90 miles from Chicago. The Grange signing clearly violated NFL rules, but Halas didn't care about that before they completed their eligibility. But the signing of Red Grange and a subsequent national barnstorming tour by the Bears probably saved the National Football League in the 1920s. It was an illegal signing because it clearly violated NFL rules. But hey, let's go. Let's hit the road. And they do. On Thanksgiving Day, crowd of 36,000 people, the largest crowd in pro football history, watched Grange and the Halas' Bears play the Chicago Cardinals at Wrigley Field. They take off and go on an 8-game, 12-day barnstorming tour in St. Louis, in Philadelphia, in New York, in Washington, in Boston, in Pittsburgh, in Detroit, and then back to Chicago. The New York game is particularly important to the health of the NFL because Red Grange saved the Giants franchise. A crowd of 73,000 people watched the Bears play the Giants at the Polo Grounds. Giants should retire the number 77, even though Red Grange never played a game with the New York Giants. But he got 73,000 people into the place, stuffed Tim Mara's pockets, and assured a future for the troubled franchise in New York. And there were other teams in New York at that point. Staten Island had a team, Staten Island Stapletons. The record attendance would be beaten because the barnstorming tour was in Los Angeles, 75,000 at the Memorial Coliseum in Los Angeles. While that's going on, about 90 miles from you is the little town of Pottsville. And there was a team called the Pottsville Maroons. And they should have won the 1925 championship, except they played an illegal game against the Stars from Notre Dame, former Stars from Notre Dame. On December 6, 1925, Pottsville beat the Chicago Cardinals. This was considered the NFL championship game because the two teams with the best records played one another. There was no such thing as an NFL championship game. Pottsville had a 9-2 record. Chicago Cardinals 9-1-1. The Maroons won the game. They should have won the championship. They had the best record in the NFL, but it was taken away from them. because after Pottsville beats Chicago, they're going to play an exhibition game against the former Notre Dame College Stars. And the game was going to not be played in Pottsville, but it was going to be in Philadelphia, which is, quite a bit away in those days, although there were automobiles and trains and buses in those days. The Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, the NFL team that was in the Philadelphia area, lodged a protest with the NFL commissioner, Joe Carr. Frankfurt claimed that Pottsville was violating the Yellow Jackets' territory and drawing fans away from their game in Frankfurt. They were playing the same day. Joe Carr said, hey, you know what, Frankfurt, you're right. Prior to the Pottsville Notre Dame game, Carr warned the Maroons 3 times, don't play the game. Carr fined Pottsville $500, then suspended the team's right to the championship and eventually would take away the Pottsville franchise. The owner of the Chicago team, Chris O'Brien, said that he would only accept the title if it was clearly won on the field. The NFL recognizes today Chicago is the 1925 champion. The NFL has opened some inquiries over the years about what happened with Pottsville. Nothing happened with Pottsville. They let it stand. And Ed Rendell, I was in a documentary called The Sons of Ben about the Chester Major League Soccer team. And Rendell in 2003 asked the NFL to open up an investigation again into what happened in 1925, but the NFL clearly isn't interested. Chicago is the champion, and Pottsville, well, it's a nice footnote in NFL history. Meanwhile, Red Grange. Red Grange wants a National Football League team, and he wants it in New York, and he wants it at Yankee Stadium. It's Red Grange and his agent, C.C. Pyle, the first super agent ever, C.C. Pyle, also known as Cash and Carry Pyle, and they want a team. And Red Grange does help the National Football League survive. I mean, National Football League pays him back by saying, there's no way we're giving you a team. You got brother Tim Mara to take care of. You're not going to get a team. So, in those days, leagues came and went, and the first American Football League was formed. Los Angeles Wildcats, a team in New York. And it was the agent, C.C. Pyle, Cash and Carry Pyle, who decides to put this league together. He gets a 5-year lease to play at Yankee Stadium. Red Grange and Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig all in the same stadium. Pyle subsequently announced the formation of his league as a showcase for his client. Meanwhile, the Los Angeles team would be a road team. The first NFL Los Angeles team was known as the Buccaneers. That was 1926. It was a road team based in Chicago with all these Californians, primarily University of California and Southern California alum. One alum who was not on that team was John Wayne. John Wayne was kicked off his football team, Southern California, as a junior. He went on to find football players used to be extras in LA, college football players, on the lots of movie theaters. And John Wayne was on the lot of Fox, changed his name from Marion Morrison to John Wayne. And as Paul Harvey would say, now you know the rest of the story. John Wayne, of course, went on to become a big-time actor. The Buccaneers did play two true home games in Los Angeles, both of them exhibition games against the New York Yankees, but Red Grange had an injury. The Buccaneers also played 2 games in San Francisco, the last 2 games of its existence, an exhibition game in San Francisco against the AFL's Wildcats. Now, this guy told me he made $5 to $10 back 20 years ago. Football salaries allegedly $75 to $100 a game back in the 1920s. The average ticket price less than $1. For $1, you could pass by Jeffrey Lurie's Stadium on 95 and wave, and it's $1 in gas or whatever. The typical team rosters, 15 players. Revenues initially generated solely through paid attendance related concessions. Today, it's television, marketing, concessions. Standard game contract provided for guaranteed payments to the visiting team, about $1,000 per team in the early 1920s against the visitors' cut of the gate receipts. after taking 15% away for the rental and maintenance of the field. Now, the most bitter rivalry in the NFL is not New York or Philadelphia, Philadelphia or Dallas, Philadelphia or Washington, Washington or Dallas, Washington or New York. Those are not the most bitter rivalries, or those are bitter rivalries. I'm talking to a Philadelphia audience here, so I know how much hate you have for Dallas and Washington and New York Giants during the season. But the rivalry of rivalries is Green Bay and Chicago on the field, in the stands, but not in the front office. These two guys, Curly Lambeau on the right, George Halas on the left, needed each other in the 1920s, in the 1930s, in the 1940s. Lambeau was let go in Green Bay in the 1950s, but Halas still helped out in Green Bay in the 1950s, even though Lambeau was gone. Money is tight. By 1931, the NFL decreased to 10 teams and only 8 in 1932. Back in 1994, I was up in Green Bay, and they had a guy by the name of Lee Remmel, who was the Green Bay Packer public relations guy who ended up running the Green Bay Packers Hall of Fame. And I was working with John Maddon's radio show at the time. And Lee said, I want to show you something. So we walked from the Lambeau Field to the Green Bay Packer Hall of Fame. And he showed me this exhibit. And there is a $1,500 loan. Curly Lambeau, whose team is a public team, gives George Halas $1,500 so he can meet a payroll. On this piece of paper, it says, I owe you, literally, I owe you $1,500, Curly Lambeau. Without that money from Green Bay, Chicago Bears may have gone out of business. In the 1950s, Lambeau was gone, and there were fundraisers and dances to raise money to build Green Bay a new stadium. Halas would show up as the bad guy, of course, but he would show up helping Green Bay raise money for what is now known Lambeau Field, and that was in the 1950s. The Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, NFL champions, 1926. Second incarnation of the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets. They joined the NFL in 1924, but they could never play on Sunday because of Pennsylvania blue laws. So they played all their home games on Saturday. The Yellow Jackets won the 1926 NFL championship. But before the start of the 1931 season, the Frankfurt Stadium was severely damaged by a fire. The club had to go elsewhere to play. They went to Municipal Stadium, which is now the home, I think, of the Flyers and the 76ers, right? Or is it the Phillies? One of those teams play on the Municipal Stadium property. Could even be the Eagles. And the long gone Baker Bowl. The team really wanted to get support from the entire Philadelphia area. It failed. The team folded after the 1931 season because of finances. Bert Bell brings the Philadelphia Eagles into the league in 1933, and the team's named the Eagles because of the NRA, the National Recovery Act. They took the Eagle from the National Recovery Act and said, it's a good name for the team. They were the Eagles, starting in 1933. Around this time, 1930s, Hollywood found football. Most of the Hollywood movies were based on the college game. There is one movie that all these years later, 88 years later, that really holds up. And it's with the Marx Brothers. And it lampoons college sports. And it lampoons recruiting football players. Quincy Adams Wagstaff is the new president of Huxley. Groucho Marx accidentally hires two speakeasy characters, Baravelli, who is Chico Marx, and Pinky, Harpo Marx, to help the school win the big football game against Darwin. How does Quincy Adams Wagstaff end up at a speakeasy? Well, that's because of his son, played by Zeppo Marx. And they start talking about football, how Huxley hasn't beaten Darwin since the 1880s. And, well, you know, it was a college need. It needs a good football team, and it needs a good stadium. And let's knock down the classrooms for a stadium. All these kind of jokes are going through there. Where will the students sleep? In the classroom. But anyway, so he goes to the speakeasy, hires these two guys, mayhem ensues, and Huxley would beat Darwin. It's a great movie. When I give the politics of sports business talk to, say, Widener or Temple, I urge the students to spend 66 minutes and watch Horse Feathers. It is a great, great movie. It's called Horse Feathers. Mickey Mouse and Popeye were subjects of the first two football cartoons. There was even a song written. You've got to be a football hero to get along with all the beautiful girls, done by Al Sherman, Buddy Fields, and Al Lewis. No, not Grandpa Munster or Leo Schnauzer from Car 54. It was somebody else. Leo Feist Publishing Company. You've got to be a football hero. And that was a cartoon with Popeye. You got to be a football hero. There they are, Zeppo, Groucho, Harpo, and Chico, and the football in Horse Feathers. Touchdown, Mickey Mouse, Walt Disney. Look at that football. It looks like a watermelon, doesn't it? They weren't watermelons anymore. Mickey Mouse. And you got to be a football hero as the two men fight over the affections of olive oil. They were always fighting over the affections of olive oil in those Max Fleischer cartoons. This guy, G.A. Richards, you've never heard of him, but G.A. Richards started to put professional in professional football. He owned the radio station WGR in Detroit, and he decides to buy a football team, a failing football team in his backyard, actually in Portsmouth, Ohio, and he moves them to Detroit. The NFL in 1934 discovers through G.A. Richards media as a revenue generator. He puts his games on radio, and he puts the Thanksgiving game on, Lions game, on NBC Radio. It was an NBC affiliate. Within 6 years, the NFL is on TV. It would be David Sarnoff putting them on radio, David Sarnoff putting them on TV with NBC back in the 1930s. G.A. Richards, the Thanksgiving game that's played in Detroit every year, was a gimmick. He needed people to go to his stadium, and he kind of figured since the Detroit Thanksgiving Day parade ended in front of the stadium, maybe some of those people would go into the stadium. They did. The Lions played the game through World War II, and they picked up in 1946 after the war. The second incarnation of the American Football League, AFL2, becomes a rival to the NFL in 1936. The NFL had 9 teams, including the Eagles, and played in many of the largest population centers. The AFL decided to compete with the NFL in many of the same cities, folds after 1 year, but the NFL starts this process of taking teams in from other leagues. Cleveland Rams move over from the NFL to the AFL to the NFL. Also around this time, there's this guy. You've never heard of him, but if you're better, you should know who he is. His name is Charles K. McNeill. He went to the University of Chicago. He was a mathematics expert. Taught at Riverdale High School in New York. One of his students was John F. Kennedy back in the 1930s. He was a compulsive gambler, and he should be in every Hall of Fame as a builder because he actually got more people interested in sports through point spreads in football, but in other sports as well. And this is what he did. He may have invented the point spread. Nobody's really sure who invented it, but it made the outcome of football games a lot more interesting. And it was just more than the final score for bettors. It's not known if he actually came up with the idea, although he was a mathematical genius, or borrowed it. But he certainly refined it, and he opened up a new, albeit illegal, industry. People would start betting on scores, not which team won. And that became a big component in the popularizing college football and eventually the National Football League. World War II comes around. The NFL is got a problem because most of their guys have been drafted. And the Pittsburgh Steelers have a big problem. they can't get any players because the NFL teams that were playing were able to play like in Philadelphia because they had the Philadelphia Navy Yard. In Chicago, they had the Great Lakes Navy was over there, and you had West Point in New York. So New York had two teams, New York and Brooklyn at the time. So they were able to get players. Pittsburgh decides in 1943, Art Rooney, he's going to go partners with Burt Bell, the Eagles owner, and they're going to have a combined team in 1943. Really didn't work out. Philadelphia decided to have a standalone team in 1944. But Art Rooney found Chicago Cardinals. They were glad to help the Steelers out. The 1943 team was known as the Steagles, the combination of the two teams, Steagles, and the 1944 team was known as Cardinals, Pittsburgh. Had the war not ended in 1945, the Pittsburgh Steelers would have combined forces with the Brooklyn team in the National Football League. Surviving as a league, teams survived by recruiting retired players or using college players. Teams were located near Army and Navy bases. Players were stationed nearby. As I said, Pittsburgh was a problem, and Art Rooney merged his teams, both in 43 and 44. Now, the National Football League barred African-American players back in the day, colored players, Negro players from the league from 1933 to 1945. It was done because they think of George Preston Marshall, who was the owner of the Boston team, who moved to Washington in 1937, and he was a racist, and he had no problems. If you called him a racist, he had no problems with that. In fact, in the 1950s, Maury Povich, who some of you might know from the Who's Your Daddy show, the Maury show, his father, Shirley Povich, was the Washington Post sports editor, and he asked George Preston Marshall, said, when are you going to hire colored players? And George Preston Marshall's response was, well, when the Harlem Globetrotters hire white players, we will hire colored players. Eventually, the Kennedy administration would force George Preston Marshall's hand, and he would desegregate in 1962. The NFL was a mom and pop operation still when the war was over in 1945. And they would have competition from a new league in 1946, the All-American Football Conference. Negro players would come back in 1946. And it would be the first time in a bunch of years. The NFL decides to go to Los Angeles in 1946. Actually, the NFL didn't decide. It was Daniel Reeves, the owner of the Cleveland Rams, and he decides he's going to go to Los Angeles. And you might recognize Kirk Douglas in that movie, Spartacus. You probably don't know the guy in front of him. The guy in front of him is Woody Strode. Woody Strode and Kenny Washington would become the first African-American player since 1932 to play in the NFL. But it wasn't easy getting them there. Reeves decides he's moving to Los Angeles, and the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum Commission tells Reeves, well, this place was built with both federal and state money. We are equal opportunity employees, which means that you cannot discriminate. Okay, Reeves said, that's fine. We have no problems with that. Handshake, we have a deal. But he's got to go back to the other NFL owners and say, hey, look, we have to desegregate. And the other owners said no. George Halas recognized that there were some great Negro players like Kenny Washington, played in the Pacific Coast League, which was a league that didn't care what color you were. Jackie Robinson played in that league. There were Kenny Washington also played at USC. The league said no. And Reeves said, well, I can't go to Los Angeles. Finally, they said, okay, you could go. Los Angeles, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco were growing markets following World War II. So Woody Strode and Kenny Washington would break the color barrier. They would be in the NFL prior to Jackie Robinson being in Major League Baseball. 33 players per team, 31 guys getting along, and these two guys treated like pariahs in the National Football League. So he moves. The San Francisco 49ers, along with the Baltimore Colts and the Cleveland Browns, would join the National Football League in 1950 after 4 years in the AAFC. The AAFC, Paul Brown ran the Cleveland franchise, and he told me once, he said, I have no problems, absolutely no problems breaking the color barrier. And he says, I hire football players. I don't care if they're green, red, Martian, black, or white. Strode and Washington go to the Rams. Meanwhile, there is Paul Brown with Marion Motley. Bill Willis and Marion Motley were hired by Paul Brown. They became teammates, lifelong friends with the Browns of the AAFC. They endured taunts, racial slurs, dirty play from opponents on the field. Cleveland was supposed to play the Miami Seahawks in Miami at the Orange Bowl in 1946. Brown didn't take them because of death threats that they received, but their teammates welcomed them with open arms. There was a guy by the name of Wally Triplett who passed away a couple of years ago, who actually was from the Philadelphia area. And Wally's father ran the Philadelphia Negro Baseball League team. And they took in Jackie Robinson, the Triplett family, when Jackie came to Philadelphia to play. And as Wally's told me, that Jackie loved his mother's colored greens. But I bring that story up because Wally Triplett was recruited. How he was recruited, nobody saw him. They just heard that or read newspaper accounts. He was recruited out of Philadelphia. And he was sent a letter, and they said, we're interested in you. And he sent a letter back. He said, you sure you want me? I'm a Negro. And he ended up going to Penn State, and was one of the first African-Americans ever drafted in the NFL with Detroit. Wally Triplett, the Triplett family from Philadelphia. Meanwhile, TV becomes a problem. Shouldn't have been a problem, but it becomes a problem. Admiral TV. Some of you might remember the Admiral TV. Los Angeles Rams against the Cleveland Browns, December 24th, 1950, in this advertising. Los Angeles Rams signed a deal with Admiral TV, local TV deal. Weren't networks in those days. And they got a lot of money from Admiral, but the thought is you want to watch a football game, you can at home. You go to your appliance store and buy an Admiral. That was the whole thing. We're going to pay for all that. But the Rams found out something. In 1949, for the 6 games in the Los Angeles Coliseum, there were more than 300,000 fans that went to 6 games. In 1950, only 150,000 went because the games were on TV, and you could sit home, watch TV. Burt Bell, who was now the commissioner of the NFL, moving up from the owner of the Philadelphia Eagles, said NFL teams shouldn't televise home games. And they imposed the blackout starting in 1951. That blackout rule is still being debated in Washington. The FCC suggested to end the rule. Richard Nixon would sign legislation, temporary legislation, in 1973 to reverse the blackout. If you sell out 72 hours before a game, the team could be shown in its home market, or the game could be shown in its home market. So the NFL by the 1950s is beginning to become the billion-dollar entity that it would become. But it was a semi-pro operation. There's Stan Jones, who played with the Chicago Bears in the 1950s, and I had an interview with him. The NFL had 13 teams in 1950. Stan Jones talked about the semi-pro angle of the league because his team, the Chicago Bears, would finish the season in December, and he had to get a job for 6 months. We weren't a full-time operation. A lot of people don't realize that. The football teams closed after the last game of the year and packed everything away. And George Halas wasn't a full-time football man himself. Most of the players weren't even paid during 8 weeks of training camp in the 1950s. In fact, the players didn't have to have their own equipment except for shoes. Shoes became a commodity because rookies would come in and they'd be cut, and these players would buy the shoes, and new rookies would come in and sell it, buy the shoes for $1, sell it for $2, and they would use that profit to buy beer, because beer was cheap, 25 cents in those days. But it wasn't a full-time job. Andy Robustelli, some of you Eagle fans may remember Andy Robustelli with the Giants, actually started his career in Los Angeles. Up in Stamford, Connecticut, he had a travel agency and a sporting goods company, and he told Daniel Reeves, he said, I can't play football here anymore. I want to continue playing football, but I can't play football here because I can't be away for the 8 weeks of training camp, then the 12 weeks, and maybe a championship game. I can't do it. I can't be away from my business half a year. He traded him to the New York Giants. That wasn't unusual back in those days. They wanted to play football. They were decent football players. They got traded to a home area. Burt Bell, the Eagles founder, the NFL commissioner, they start to think about, hey, this game is gaining some popularity because it's a good TV game. By 1956, Bell and the 12-team owners said, hey, you know what? Let's see if we could expand. And let's see, Houston sounds good. We'll go back to Dallas. Even though we failed in Dallas in 1952, maybe under the right set of circumstances, we could survive in Dallas, we could survive in Houston. And there's a problem in Chicago. Chicago Cardinals, Chicago Bears sharing the town. None of their games are on TV. And Bill Paley, who founded CBS in Philadelphia, has the rights on WBBM in Chicago to both teams. And he's not very happy with the fact that he can't show any games in Chicago on his owned and operated station. The 1958 NFL championship game would change pro football. The American Football League would start in 1959. The Cardinals' dilemma was somewhat solved because they would play 2 home games a year in Minneapolis or Buffalo, and that opened up the Chicago market for TV. Lamar Hunt in Dallas and Bud Adams in Houston tried to buy the Chicago team. They failed. Hunt wanted to put the team in Dallas, Adams in Houston. In 1959, they threw up their hands and started the American Football League. The Bidwell family would move the team, the Cardinals, from Chicago to St. Louis. It was a CBS deal as well. Paley and CBS throw in $500,000 to help the Bidwells financially, allegedly to move a grandstand from Comiskey Park in Chicago to Busch Stadium in St. Louis. And that is how TV paid for the movement of that team, and Chicago could finally see NFL football on a regular basis. That's Alan Amici going over for the winning touchdown in the so-called greatest game ever played in 1958 with the Baltimore Colts beating the New York Giants in overtime. It was December 28th, the day that the modern NFL started. Colts beat the Giants in overtime. Unitas in overtime. Johnny Unitas drives his Baltimore Colts downfield, overtime, hands off to Alan Amici, takes the handoff, plows into the end zone. Colts win the game. Artie Donovan said it wasn't the greatest game ever played. In fact, it was one of the worst games that we played all year. But the game caught the attention of the American public. It was right there. There was overtime drama. You could see everything on TV. Well, you couldn't see everything on TV because somebody accidentally pulled a cord on the field, NBC, and the game went dead for about 12 minutes before they could get it back on. After watching that game, Lamar Hunt said, if I can't join them, I'm going to form a rival circuit, the American Football League. It is Lamar Hunt, not the NFL guys. It is Lamar Hunt who pushes football into the modern era. There is Pete Rozelle. There is me. In the background, Foley Square, USFL, NFL antitrust trial. In 1986, Rozelle becomes the NFL commissioner in 1960, and that is where the NFL becomes big business. Both Pete and I are smiling because he must have said something but anyway, Pete modernizes the NFL. The swinging 60s. Pro football entirely changed between 58 and 66. There is an impact from the never got off the ground Continental Baseball League. Branch Rickey, the guy who signed Jackie Robinson for the Brooklyn Dodgers, who set up the farm system in Major League Baseball. was out of baseball. So he decides with a bunch of others, we're going to form a third major league and claim major league status by 1963. So they go all around the country looking at prospective owners. The Continental Baseball League never gets off the ground, but if you watch today's NFL, you see the imprint. He leaves Lamar Hunt a bunch of papers. Are you interested in the Continental Baseball League? Lamar takes a look at it. Co-ops almost everything in there, including television, how all 8 teams would share TV equally. Baseball could do that. They didn't have an antitrust, or they had an antitrust exemption. Lamar takes all of that, applies it to the American Football League. The AFL gets TV deal with ABC. All the money is shared equally. The NFL doesn't have that. New York and Green Bay have separate TV deals. New York has a big TV deal, biggest market in the country. Green Bay almost gets no money. They got a little TV deal in Wisconsin. The American Football League, by the way, their television deal with ABC was cut by a guy by the name of Jay Michaels. You don't know the name Jay Michaels, but you do know his son, Al Michaels, and Inside TV, you know his other son, David Michaels, an NBC producer, and his daughter, Susan Michaels. I did a TV show, one of the worst TV shows I ever did, on History's Mysteries, to 88 minutes. No, it was more than 88 minutes. It was 108 minutes of the history of sports from the Roman days through 1998. And it was terrible. It was on Arts and Entertainment called History's Mysteries. But Jay Michael's son, Al, does the NFL on Sunday nights on NBC. Congress would get involved with the National Football League. They would allow Pete Rozelle or honor his request for all 14 NFL teams to be packaged as one to sell to a TV network. September 30th, 1961, Kennedy signs that into law. Kennedy also desegregates the Washington team. George Preston Marshall is looking to move to a new stadium in Washington to play in 1962, leaving Griffith Stadium for the new cookie cutter stadium. And Stuart Udell, who was the Interior Secretary, told George Preston Marshall, unless you desegregate, because it's being built with federal money, like everything else is in Washington of major impact, you got to hire Negro players. And George Preston Marshall would cater to or cave in. And he traded for Bobby Mitchell. Best thing that ever happened to Bobby Mitchell's career. He was at every party ever in Washington between 1963 and 2005. And I once said to him, better than being a dentist. He said, yeah, it was. He was supposed to be a dentist. The AFL, NFL get into a bidding war thanks to David Sarnoff at NBC. Sarnoff was upset that he kept losing to Bill Paley, the NFL rights, so he calls Sonny. David, Sonny, as in money, Werblin, as Howard Cosell would say, how much did that SOB give the NFL? He said $35 million. He said, here's $35 million in the buck. Go ahead and build the league. Sonny Werblin signed Joe Namath with that money. And eventually there would be a merger of the NFL. New Orleans would become a political football because there was no AFL All-Star game played in New Orleans in 1965 because of Jim Crow. And that game was moved to Houston. The merger is presented to Congress. Russell Long, the Democratic senator from Louisiana, and Hal Boggs, the Democratic congressman from Louisiana, said, we're not voting for this. Eventually, there would be a compromise. New Orleans would get an expansion team. The leagues would merge, and that would form the Super Bowl. Super Bowl 1 and 2, Green Bay beats Kansas City and Oakland in 67-68. Minimal impact. But Joe Namath and the Jets beat Baltimore in Super Bowl 3, and they make the Super Bowl. Joe Namath is in Football Hall of Fame for one reason. He won the biggest game of the AFL's career and probably the second biggest game in NFL history behind the Baltimore Colts New York Giants game in 1958. And as Ron Mix, who's a Hall of Fame offensive tackle from the American Football League, said to me, Joe validated the careers of all of us who played in the American Football League. And there's Bruce Morton to my left, who is on here. And there's me on the right, talking to Joe Namath in 1988. And behind Bruce is Weave Eubank, the guy with the glasses who won the World Championship game in 1958 and won the Super Bowl in 1969. He too in the Hall of Fame. Monday Night Football comes in 1970 with Howard Cosell. I'm still friendly with his grandsons, Justin and Colin. Colin is the PA announcer for the New York Mets. Keith Jackson in the middle, and Dandy and the Dandaroo, Don Meredith. Keith Jackson once told me the best thing that ever happened to him was lasting only 1 year in the booth. He couldn't keep up with Howard and Dandy Don's drinking. Monday Night Football was designed as an entertainment show that happened to have football. In fact, ABC, some of the money that went into buying the rights came from ABC Entertainment. Cosell was the first guy hired. Frank Gifford told Rune Arlich, hire Don Meredith. He'd be a perfect foil for the entertainment and antics of Cosell. Gifford would become the announcer on Monday Night Football in 1971. By 1970, it's a business. Television contracts enriched owners and players beyond what they ever thought. There was another new league that started in 1973 called the World Football League. The NFL decides to cut off 2 cities that the WFL might take, Seattle and Tampa, for expansion. 1976. World Football League starts in 1974. The Philadelphia Bell, you might remember, had 60,000 people in the stadium in Philadelphia and found out that nobody paid for tickets. The World Football League would expire after 1975. Players Association, NFL owners, they had wars. The first was a preseason game between New England and the New York Jets, boycotted by the players. That would eventually lead to all kinds of court cases. In the 1980s, there's Bruce behind the ESPN mic, there's me, and Philadelphia's own Harvey Meyerson, who was the attorney for the USFL, who actually won the USFL NFL trial, but lost it because he never specified how much money the USFL wanted for being injured by the NFL. So a lot of pains in football in the 1980s. The 1982 NFL players' strike. USFL starts in 83. The USFL antitrust suit with the NFL is in 86. There's an 87 NFL players' strike. The game's popularity skyrockets, and TV enriches the owners and players more and more. Rupert Murdoch rolls the dice on the NFL that his Fox network could survive. Fox in those days had The Simpsons, Tracy Ullman, and Gary Shandling. He rolled the dice and he won. The NFL paid off big time for him. In fact, he got UHF affiliates out of it in Detroit and Cleveland and Milwaukee. The NFL becomes a political force in Arizona. Arizona decides they are not going to have the Martin Luther King Day holiday. The NFL says that if you want a Super Bowl, you better have it. Arizona says no in 1990 in a vote for the holiday. The NFL pulls the Super Bowl out in 92. They give them a do-over in 1992, saying if you want the Super Bowl in 96, you better pass it. They did. And Arizona got a Super Bowl in 1996. So the NFL becomes really, really powerful by the 1990s. Franchise movement, Cleveland moves to Baltimore, the LA Raiders back to Oakland, the Anaheim Raiders, still known as Los Angeles Raiders, who moved after the 1980 season to Anaheim, the 79 season to Anaheim in 1980, go to St. Louis, and Houston goes to Nashville. Brain injuries. That's going to be the biggest problem going ahead. Somehow it's been swept under the table. You don't hear about it anymore. The concussions, all gone, all gone. And Colin Kaepernick, he's been blackballed from the NFL. There have been some changes this year after George Floyd and the protests. Roger Goodell did say Black Lives Matter. Colin was right, but he hasn't gotten another chance. In 2016, he took a knee during the national anthem, protesting what he said was police brutality against the Black community. He part of it is on him. He decided not to sign an option after 2016. Went shopping. Nobody went after him. Nobody went after him. And to this day, really, nobody has any interest in Colin Kaepernick. 21st century, well, it's a well-oiled machine. Concussions are a problem. 2014, Barack Obama brought the attention to the White House, and he had a concussions day. And he said that if he had sons, he would not allow them to play football because football is a brutal game. And concussions, there have been some concussion settlements. Nobody really talks about it. There was a movie called Concussion with Will Smith about Dr. Amalu, and it kind of went away, and concussions went away, and the NFL is still grappling with how players deal with racial issues. And yeah, I survived an Oakland Raiders party. If you were in Philadelphia and you used to watch New York Giants games, you probably saw Miss Super Bowl, Sandra Fortunato. There's me at a party with Big Ben Davidson and Phil Filippiano, who is one of the craziest people I've ever met in my life. Kelly, thank you so much for inviting me. Any questions or any comments? I am here. You could unmute the microphones.
Absolutely. Yep.
And
Thank
I hope
you.
you enjoyed it.
Anything at all? Questions or comments?
Well, if there are no questions or no comments, I'm going to stop